Hey everyone, and welcome back. You guys sent in a huge pile of EU documents on sustainability reporting and due diligence. Like you're really trying to get a handle on these new regulations, huh? Well, don't worry, that's what we're here for. We're going to cut through all the jargon and help you figure out what really matters.
Exactly. We're focusing on two key pieces of legislation today, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the one everyone calls the CSDDD. And we'll also touch on the EU taxonomy, which is essentially a system for classifying activities that are environmentally sustainable.
Okay, so we're talking big and complicated regulations. And I know the EU's been saying they want to simplify things, but before we get into all that,
Yeah.
can we take a step back and look at the original goals of the CSRD and the CSDDD? What was the EU trying to achieve with these directives anyway?
Well, the CSRD was all about transparency. The idea was to make businesses more upfront about their sustainability performance, require companies to report on their environmental and social impacts, kind of like a public scorecard for everyone to see.
Mm.
The CSDDD, on the other hand, was more about accountability. It aimed to hold companies responsible for human rights abuses and environmental damage, and not just within their own operations, but anywhere in their supply chains.
Okay, transparency and accountability. Those sound like pretty straightforward goals, right?
Right.
But I have a feeling it's not quite that simple.
You're right about that. The thing is, the EU is trying to implement these directives in a very different world than when they first came up with them. You've got the war in Ukraine shaking up energy markets, rising trade tensions are making everyone nervous, and then there's this constant debate about whether the EU's sustainability goals, ambitious as they are actually putting European businesses at a disadvantage compared to, well, their competitors in other parts of the world.
Wow, that's a really interesting point. So it's not just about simplifying the rules. It's about finding that sweet spot where they're actually effective, but not such a pain that they scare businesses away. Yeah. All right, let's get into the details, starting with the CSRD. It was supposed to be rolled out in stages, right? With different types and sizes of companies having to report at different times, in waves. What's changing there?
Well, one of the big changes is they're postponing the application dates for some companies. The first wave was supposed to hit large companies in 2025, but the proposed changes would push that back to 2028. And they're raising the employee threshold for mandatory reporting to be more in line with the CSDDD. So instead of 500 employees, only companies with more than 1,000 employees would need to report. Basically, they're exempting a whole bunch of companies from having to report.
Wait, so if a company has, let's say, 900 employees, they don't have to report at all.
Right.
That seems like a pretty big change. What about the companies that are below that threshold? Are they completely off the hook?
Not exactly. The EU is proposing a voluntary standard, something that's proportionate and based on the VSME standard. This basically gives those companies a framework they can use if they want to report on their sustainability efforts, even if they're not required to.
Okay, I see. So there's some flexibility built in. But even for the companies that do have to report, this whole process can be pretty intimidating, right? What exactly are they supposed to report on? And how do they even start gathering all that information?
That's where the European Sustainability Reporting Standards come in, or ESRS for short. Think of it as the rule book for sustainability reporting. It tells companies exactly what topics they need to cover, what metrics to use, and how detailed they need to be.
Okay, so the ESRS is like the instruction manual. But I remember reading somewhere that the ESRS was a bit of a headache for companies, something about materiality assessment being a major pain point. Is that being addressed in the revised ESRS?
Oh, absolutely. One of the main goals of the revised ESRS is to simplify that whole materiality assessment process. That's the part where companies have to figure out which sustainability issues are the most important for them and their stakeholders. It was a really complex and time-consuming process, so the EU is trying to make it clearer and easier to actually do. They want companies to focus on the issues that really matter and not waste time on things that aren't so relevant.
So it's like they're cutting through the noise and trying to make reporting more focused and efficient. I like
Right.
that. Now, before we move on to the CSDD, which I know is a whole other beast, were there any other significant changes proposed for the CSRD? Anything that really jumped out at you?
Well, besides the changes to the rollout and the materiality assessment, the EU is really emphasizing the need to simplify and streamline the ESRS as a whole. They're talking about clarifying things, making sure things are consistent, and just generally reducing the burden on companies. It's all about making the process more manageable without sacrificing the quality or the detail of the information being reported.
Okay, so it sounds like they're trying to strike a balance between being thorough and being practical. I get it. Now, I think it's time to tackle the CSDDD, which from what I've read is a whole different level of complexity. This one's all about due diligence, right? Making sure companies aren't ignoring human rights abuses or environmental damage in their supply chains.
You got it. The CSDDD requires companies to actually identify, prevent, and mitigate any negative impacts, not just in their own operations, but throughout their entire supply chains. And just like with the CSRD, the EU is proposing changes to make the CSDDD a little easier for businesses to handle.
Okay, I'm ready to dive in. But before we do, can you give me like a simple analogy to help me understand what this whole due diligence thing is all about? It sounds kind of like detective work to me.
That's a great analogy. Think of it as a detective investigating your supply chain. You've got to look for clues of human rights abuses or environmental damage, and then take action to fix the problems you find. You can't just plead ignorance anymore. You have a legal responsibility to know what's going on and to take steps to prevent bad things from happening.
Okay, that makes sense. So companies need to be proactive, not just reactive. But I can only imagine how challenging that must be, especially for companies with these massive global supply chains. Where do you even begin with something like that?
It's a huge challenge for sure, and that's exactly why the EU is proposing changes to make the CSDD a bit more focused. One of the biggest shifts is moving away from this idea of looking at the entire supply chain to focusing mainly on direct business partners, unless there's clear evidence of problems further down the line.
Hold on, so instead of having to scrutinize every single supplier in their network, companies can focus on their immediate suppliers unless there are red flags. That seems like a pretty big change. Doesn't that create a risk of missing problems that are further down the supply chain?
It's a valid concern, and it's been a topic of a lot of discussion. The original CSDDD was pretty broad, requiring companies to assess risks even with indirect partners way down the chain. But the proposed changes are meant to be more realistic. They acknowledge that it can be incredibly difficult for companies to keep tags on every single level of their supply chain. So the focus is shifting to those direct relationships, unless there are clear warning signs that something needs further investigation.
Okay, I see the logic there. Focus on where you have the most leverage and investigate red flags when they pop up. It sounds like a much more realistic approach. But I'm guessing there are other changes in the works too, right? Things that are going to make the CSDDD less burdensome for companies.
You bet. They're also looking at reducing how often companies have to monitor things and clarifying the whole stakeholder engagement piece. The initial requirements were pretty demanding in terms of how often companies had to assess risks and engage with stakeholders. The changes aim to make those processes more targeted and efficient.
So it's about finding that balance again, right? Making sure due diligence is done, but without overwhelming businesses with tons of requirements. I also remember reading something about the duty to terminate being removed as a last resort. Can you explain that? It sounds pretty significant.
It is significant. Initially, the CSDD said that companies had to end business relationships if they couldn't fix the problems, if everything else failed to address adverse impacts. Basically, if a company couldn't get a supplier to clean up their act, they were legally obligated to cut ties. But in the proposed changes, that duty to terminate has been replaced with other measures like suspending activities or finding ways to increase their leverage to push for those improvements.
Wait, so instead of being forced to end a partnership, companies can just hit the pause button or try to use their influence to push for change? Isn't that kind of a loophole? What's to stop companies from just continuing to work with suppliers that aren't ethical?
That's a good question. The EU is trying to find a more nuanced approach, something that recognizes how complex global supply chains really are. Ending a business relationship can have unintended consequences. It could end up harming the livelihoods of workers or even making the situation worse. The idea is to give companies more flexibility to address those problems without having to resort to such a drastic measure.
Okay, I see. It's about finding alternatives to just walking away. But what happens if a company just completely ignores the CSDDD? What are the consequences for them?
Well, the EU is definitely not messing around when it comes to enforcement. One of the proposed changes is actually removing the minimum fine cap for CSDDD violations. Originally, there was a limit on how low the fines could be, but now it seems like the penalties will be based on how bad the infringement is, which could mean much higher fines for companies that seriously mess up.
So, no more slaps on the wrist with a small fine. It sounds like the EU is sending a clear message that they're serious about holding companies accountable. But what about the impact on EU businesses? I mean, if they're being held to these high standards while businesses in other parts of the world aren't, won't that put them at a disadvantage?
It's a concern that businesses have definitely brought up, and it's something the EU is very aware of. They're trying to simplify the rules without making them less effective. And they're also emphasizing the long-term benefits of sustainability, things like attracting investment and fostering innovation.
Okay, so it's not just about following the rules, it's about creating a more sustainable and resilient business environment overall. But it's clear that the EU has a tough balancing act to pull off here, trying to be ambitious while also being pragmatic. What else is changing with the CSDDD?
They've also made changes to the civil liability clause, which could make it easier for victims of corporate negligence to actually get compensation. And while stakeholder engagement is still a requirement, the EU has tried to clarify which stakeholders companies actually need to engage with.
Okay, so it's not just about fines and penalties. It's about giving more power to individuals and communities who are actually harmed by corporate actions, letting them seek some kind of justice. That's a pretty big deal. Before we move on to the EU taxonomy, I have one last question about the CSDDD. Is there anything in the documents you sent that suggests these changes will actually save companies money? I mean, it sounds good in theory, but are there any actual estimates?
That's a great question. And yes, there are some estimates. If you look at the proposed changes, like narrowing the scope of due diligence and reducing how often monitoring needs to happen, the potential savings could be pretty substantial. We could be talking upwards of 200 million euros annually.
Wow, that's a lot of money. So there's a real financial incentive for companies to get on board with these changes. It's not just about doing the right thing, it's about smart business.
Exactly. And remember, those savings are just for the CSDDD. We haven't even talked about the potential cost savings from simplifying the CSRD and the EU taxonomy reporting requirements yet.
Okay, so potentially even more savings on the horizon. Now, I think it's time to finally tackle that EU taxonomy. This one always seems to trip people up. Can you explain it to me like I'm 5 years old?
Okay, imagine you have a nutritional label, but for investments. That's basically what the EU taxonomy is. It's a list of economic activities that can be considered environmentally sustainable. It's designed to help investors know if they're putting their money into projects that are actually good for the planet or if it's just greenwashing.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like a guide for investors who want to make sure their money is going towards activities that actually align with the EU's sustainability goals.
Mhm.
But I'm guessing it's not as simple as just checking a list, is it?
You're right, it can get pretty complicated. Companies have to demonstrate that they're taxonomy aligned, which means they need to show that their activities meet certain criteria and contribute to at least one of the EU's environmental objectives.
And what about the companies that aren't directly involved in those environmentally sustainable activities? How does the taxonomy affect them?
That's where things get even more interesting. Financial institutions, like banks and investment funds, have to deal with something called the Green Asset Ratio, or GAR. This measures how much of their portfolio is actually invested in taxonomy-aligned activities. It's basically a way of figuring out how green their investments really are.
So if a bank wants to be seen as green, they need to have a high GAR, which means they'll be more likely to invest in companies that align with the EU taxonomy. And that could shift billions of euros towards sustainable activities.
Exactly. It's all connected. And it's just one example of how the EU is trying to use these regulations to create a real shift towards a more sustainable economy.
Wow, this is a lot to take in. But it's starting to make sense now. The CSRD is about transparency, the CSDDD is about accountability, and the EU taxonomy is about guiding investments towards sustainable activities. They're all pieces of the same puzzle.
Precisely. And it's a puzzle that's constantly changing and evolving.
Well, I think we've covered a ton of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've looked at the initial goals of the CSRD and the CSDDD, the proposed changes, the potential cost savings, and the implications of the EU taxonomy.
I think we've definitely laid the groundwork for understanding how complex these regulations really are. So, welcome back. We spent a good chunk of time talking about what these EU sustainability regulations are and how they're changing. But let's get down to brass tacks here. How are businesses actually reacting to all of this?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm guessing it's not all sunshine and roses. I mean, yeah, we've talked about the potential for cost savings, but there have to be some serious concerns too, right?
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest concerns you hear is about the cost of compliance. And that's especially true for small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs as they're called. They often just don't have the resources or the expertise to navigate all these complex regulations. It's kind of like asking someone who's never climbed a mountain to suddenly scale Everest without any training or gear. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get it. It can feel pretty overwhelming, especially for smaller companies that are already stretched pretty thin. Are there any specific examples from the documents you sent that really show this struggle?
Yeah, actually, a lot of reports highlight how hard it is for SMEs to even gather the data they need for reporting. especially when it comes to those more complicated topics like the EU taxonomy and climate transition plans. It's not just about filling out some forms, it's about really understanding these concepts and figuring out how they apply to their specific business, which is a lot to ask.
It sounds like a lot of companies are feeling a bit lost, to put it mildly. But the EU is trying to address these concerns, right? I mean, they keep talking about simplifying things, but is that really enough?
Well, they are making an effort, that's for sure. For example, IFA-FRE, that's the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, is working on guidance documents, Q&A platforms, and other resources to help companies understand and comply with these new reporting standards. You could say they're like the park rangers, trying to guide companies through this unfamiliar territory.
Okay, so there's at least some support out there. But I'm guessing it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. What about companies with unique challenges or specific questions? Who can they turn to?
Well, that's where the European Commission comes in. They're really committed to providing more clarity and support, working with different stakeholders to find practical solutions. They're like the mountain rescue team, ready to help out companies that are struggling.
So at least there's a safety net. That's good to know. But what about the bigger picture? The EU is always pushing for a global level playing field, talking about international standards and cooperation. But realistically, how likely are other major players, like China or the US, to actually adopt similar standards?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? In a perfect world, everyone would be on the same page, working together to solve these global challenges. But the reality is, the geopolitical landscape is pretty complicated. Everyone's got different priorities, different economic models, and different levels of commitment to sustainability.
So it's kind of like trying to get everyone to agree on the best way to reach the summit, even though they're all starting from different base camps with different goals in mind.
Exactly. And that's why the EU is in such a tough spot. They want to be ambitious, really push for change, but they also have to think about what it'll mean for European businesses. If they go too far, too fast, they risk alienating businesses and sending investment elsewhere.
It's a balancing act for sure. But let's flip things around for a second. We've talked a lot about the potential downsides, but are there ways these changes could actually save companies money in the long run?
There's definitely potential for that. By simplifying things and making the guidance clearer, the EU is hoping to reduce the need for companies to rely so much on external consultants, which can cost a fortune.
Right, so instead of hiring those expensive Sherpas to guide them through the regulations, companies can learn to navigate the terrain themselves.
Exactly. And remember, we talked about those potential cost savings from streamlining the CSDDD upwards of 200 million euros a year. Plus, there are estimates that simplifying the EU taxonomy reporting could save businesses over 300 million euros annually.
Wow, so that's over 500 million euros in potential savings. That's not small potatoes.
No, it's not. And it's a big part of the EU's strategy. They want to make it clear that sustainability isn't just the right thing to do, it's actually good business.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But even with the potential for savings, I'm sure there are still some companies out there dragging their feet, resisting all this change.
Oh, there are always going to be those who resist change, especially when it involves new regulations and potential costs. But the truth is, the sustainability train has already left the station, and companies that don't get on board are going to get left behind.
It sounds like there are both challenges and opportunities to navigate here. But let's focus on the opportunities for a moment. We talked about the potential for saving money, but what other benefits could companies get by embracing these regulations?
That's a great question. There are actually quite a few potential benefits. For one, companies that align with the EU taxonomy can attract investors who are increasingly looking for sustainable investments. It's like having a seal of approval that says we're doing things the right way.
So it's not just about avoiding penalties, it's about attracting investment and building a good reputation.
Exactly. And it's not just about investors either. It's also about attracting talent. More and more people, especially younger generations, want to work for companies that are committed to sustainability. It's becoming a big deal for attracting and keeping good employees.
Okay, so there are some real business advantages to be gained by getting on board with these regulations. But let's circle back to one of the most controversial issues we talked about earlier, the idea of limiting due diligence to just direct business partners, those tier one suppliers. This seems to be a major sticking point. Some people argue that it'll make things easier for companies, while others are worried that it'll make the CSDDD less effective.
That's the heart of the debate, for sure. The EU is walking a tightrope, trying to simplify things without making the regulations useless.
It's a delicate balancing act, that's for sure.
Huh.
But let's play devil's advocate here. What's the worst-case scenario if the EU gets this wrong? What if they simplify too much or don't enforce the rules properly?
Well, the worst-case scenario is that these regulations end up being completely toothless. Just a bunch of pointless bureaucracy. Companies could figure out ways to get around the rules, greenwashing their activities while continuing to do things that aren't sustainable at all.
So basically, it would all be for nothing. The regulations become meaningless, failing to achieve what they were supposed to. That's not a great outcome.
It's not, and it's a risk that the EU is well aware of. They're trying hard to find that balance, but it's tricky.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly complex and high stakes. But before we get too caught up in the potential negatives, let's go back to this idea of a global level playing field. The EU wants international standards and cooperation, but realistically, how can they get other major players like China or the US to adopt similar approaches to sustainability?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? It's one thing to implement these regulations within the EU, but it's a whole other ballgame to get the rest of the world on board. The EU's using a few different strategies. They're trying to use their economic clout, promoting these standards in trade agreements and partnerships, and they're trying to lead by example, showing that sustainability and economic growth can go hand in hand.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, using both carrots and sticks to encourage other countries to move in the same direction. Are there any examples of this working, any success stories yet?
It's still early, but there are some encouraging signs. The EU's work on promoting sustainable finance is starting to gain some traction globally. And honestly, the fact that we're even having this conversation, that sustainability is now a major priority for businesses and policymakers around the world, shows just how much influence the EU actually has.
So it's not a hopeless cause. The EU is making some progress, but it's a long and winding road.
It is, but it's a road we have to travel if we want to build a more sustainable future.
Well said. I think this is a good place to take a break for now. We've covered so much in this part of our deep dive, from the challenges and concerns businesses are facing to the potential opportunities and the EU's efforts to create a global level playing field. But there's still more to unpack. In the next part, we'll look closer at the potential long-term impact of these regulations and try to get a clearer picture of what the future holds for EU sustainability. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into these EU sustainability regulations. We've gone over a lot, but I'm really interested to hear what you think the long-term implications of all this are going to be. I mean, how will these regulations actually change how business operate, not just in the EU, but everywhere?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, I think the answer is it's still too early to say for sure. These regulations are a big deal, complex, ambitious, and they keep changing. But one thing I think we can say with confidence is they're already having a pretty big impact on how businesses think about sustainability.
Okay, so it's not just about ticking boxes and following the rules. It's actually changing the way businesses approach sustainability, making it a core part of how they operate.
You got it. And that's where I think the real potential lies. These regulations aren't just about avoiding risk and penalties. They're about building a more sustainable and resilient economy for the long term.
Okay, so it's about the big picture. But I'm curious about the specifics. What kind of changes are we likely to see in the next few years? How will these regulations actually change the business landscape?
Well, I think one thing we're going to see is a move towards more transparency and accountability across all industries. Companies are going to have to be more open about their impact, both environmentally and socially, and they're going to be held responsible for what happens in their supply chains.
So no more hiding behind complicated supply chains or making vague claims about sustainability.
Exactly. Consumers are getting smarter, and they're demanding more. Investors are starting to really factor sustainability into their decisions. Companies that don't adapt are going to be left behind.
So it's not just about compliance anymore. It's about staying competitive in a world that's changing fast.
Exactly. And I think we're going to see a huge surge in innovation as companies try to come up with new technologies, new products, and new services that are aligned with the EU's sustainability goals.
So instead of seeing these regulations as a burden, some companies will actually see them as an opportunity to get ahead of the curve.
Absolutely. The EU is basically creating a market for sustainable solutions, and the companies that can tap into that market are going to be the ones that succeed in the long run. Think about it. The EU is essentially deciding which parts of the economy will thrive by defining what counts as sustainable. The companies that align with their vision will be rewarded with access to capital, they'll have regulations that work in their favor, and there will be a growing market for what they're offering.
That's a fascinating point. It's not just about creating a level playing field anymore. It's about giving an advantage to the companies that are serious about sustainability.
Exactly, and I think this approach could have a big impact on the rest of the world. As the EU's sustainability agenda gains momentum, other countries might feel like they need to adopt similar standards just to keep up.
So it's about setting a new global standard, pushing the world towards a more sustainable future.
That's the idea, at least. Whether it actually works out that way, well, I'll have to wait and see.
Okay, so the stakes are pretty high. But before we wrap things up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. The idea that these regulations could actually drive innovation. Can you give me some real-world examples of how that might happen?
Sure. Think about the electric vehicle market. The EU's push for cleaner transportation has created a huge demand for EVs, and that's sparked a wave of innovation in things like battery technology, charging infrastructure, and even how cars are designed.
Okay, so that's one example. What about other industries?
Renewable energy is another obvious one. The EU's renewable energy targets have led to huge investments in things like solar and wind power. And as these technologies get better, they're becoming more and more competitive with fossil fuels.
So it's not just about subsidizing clean energy. It's about creating a market where clean energy can actually compete on its own.
Exactly. And I think we're going to see a similar pattern in other sectors too. The EU is really focusing on circular economy principles, and that's pushing innovation in areas like waste reduction, recycling, and designing products that are more sustainable.
So it's about building a system that's more sustainable overall, using resources more efficiently and creating less waste.
That's it. And I think that's really the ultimate goal of all of this, to shift to a more sustainable and resilient economy that's good for people and good for the planet.
That's a great vision.
Yeah.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's bring it back to our listener who's been following along, trying to understand this complex world of EU sustainability regulations. What's the one thing they should really take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that these regulations are here to stay, and they're only going to become more important in the years to come. Whether you're running a business, making investments, or just someone who cares about sustainability, you need to understand how these regulations work, what they mean for you, and how you can be a part of building a more sustainable future.
That's a great point. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that these regulations aren't set in stone. They're going to keep changing and evolving as the EU gets feedback, sees how they're working, and adapts to the changing world.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to stay informed, be a part of the conversation, and be ready to adapt as things change.
Because it's not just about following the rules. It's about shaping the future of sustainable business. So to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the EU's sustainability goals, the challenges they're facing, and the incredible opportunities that lie ahead.
Remember, the path to a more sustainable future is going to be full of challenges, but it's also full of opportunities. Don't be afraid of the complexity, stay informed, and be ready to play your part in creating a better world.
And with that, we'll leave you to think about everything we've talked about today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, happy navigating the world of sustainability.